Okay, so welcome everybody. There's still some people joining. I always try to start with a marker. Today must be September 25th, I think. And this is our Africa section, which is a kind of corollary to the larger course that we do on international crisis management. And I'm Dan Whitten. Jason Stearns has joined us. I believe he's in Addis today. Is that correct, Jason?
That's right.
Okay, and just to introduce people, oh, good, more are coming, that's good. We have some wonderful, perceptive, inquisitive, active African students and young professionals on the line, some of them from Kenya. We have some from DRC. We have actually one from Ukraine. So we have a mixed group here. I just want to introduce Ambassador Charles Ray, who was on the call, and Vivian Sequeira. These two wonderful colleagues will be giving sessions in mid-October. Today, we turn to the painful topic of DRC, especially Eastern DRC. Jason Stearns has published fantastic material in Foreign Affairs on this troubled area. The words resource curse come to mind, M23, Rwanda. It's very painful, and that at least until recently, the greatest loss of human life in combat since World War II was in Eastern Congo. This doesn't get enough attention in Western media, but Jason Stearns has been tracking this. Jason, can you give us an intro? You don't have to just be speaking about DRC, but there you are in Addis. Maybe you can explain what is it that is Addis that attracts you to live there? Can we start with that?
Well, that has very little to do with the DRC, unfortunately. That has to do with my wife's job. My wife is based at the UN Economic Commission for Africa here, and so I'm on sabbatical from my regular job as a professor in Canada.
Wonderful.
But it's a
You
good
know,
place to be based and working on the continent.
your volume is a little bit weak. I don't know if you have a way of turning it up, Jason.
I don't. I can get closer. Can you hear me now?
Actually, that's better. That's better if you could do that. Yeah. So tell us, let's admit it, this is a dark and somber topic. Later in the conversation, I'm going to ask you, when I talk with students in Washington, we talk about the glass half full and the glass half empty. At some point, tell us about the glass half full. But let's start with the stark reality of DRC and especially Eastern DRC. I turn it over to you, Jason.
Well, I've been told to keep it brief, and I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, so I thought the easiest way is just to give an introduction to the current situation in the Eastern DRC, and then
Perfect.
to see which aspect people are most interested in. There are many different ways one could address this question, but I'll give a brief overview, and forgive me if many of you know these facts already. Currently, there are 6.4 to 7 million people displaced in the Eastern DRC, making it one of the largest displacement crises in the world. There are around 100 different armed groups, although some of them are much more important than the others. The current escalation, I think that I start with those numbers because many historians would think of the conflict in the DRC, properly speaking, as having lasted between 1996 and 2003. Those are the two great Congo wars, as they're called. That was the first overthrow of Mobutu Sese Seko, and then the Second Congo War was a war during which 9 different African countries fought and divided the country up into different parts. And that came to a conclusion in 2002 with the signing of the Pretoria Agreements, and the Global and Inclusive Agreement that ushered in the Third Republic in which we are today. Now, I mention that because the Great Congo Wars, in air quotes, only displaced, if you will, around 3.6 million people. That was the height of displacement during the Great Congo Wars. And as I said before, today we're roughly twice that. And yet the Congo is perceived and is portrayed and engaged with as a post-conflict country, which of course doesn't make much sense to people living in the crisis zone. So the conflict dates back to 1993 is when most people date it, but has persisted until today, but gone through various different permutations. And I can, of course, if you are interested in understanding how the conflict has changed over the years, I can say that. But that's just to sort of to frame it. Where are we today in this conflict? Well, after the global and inclusive agreement that was signed in 2003, ushered in the Third Republic, a new constitution that was approved by referendum in 2006. There was a brief period, you talk about the glass half full, there was a brief period of, I think, optimism and de-escalation. In fact, displacements levels during the transition declined to around 1 million people displaced. Still terrible, but a long way away from the 7 million we are today. Most armed groups demobilized, 130,000 people demobilized, including 30,000 children. And the country was unified and new institutions were born, including democratic institutions that have overseen now 4 rounds of elections in the DRC. And so this was the period of optimism. Now, what went wrong? What happened? What happened were several things, but broadly speaking, the peace deal that had been signed that was supposed to bring about a political settlement between the various belligerents was not in favor of some of the most important of those belligerents, in particular, the Congolese Rally for Democracy, which was an ally, some would say a proxy, of the Rwandan government. And so in 2004, these disaffected members of the RCD, led by a general called Laurent Nkunda, defected from the National Army and launched a rebellion.
Yeah, I have, let me ask that can we, everybody mute, please? I'm getting some feedback. Sorry, Jason, go ahead.
Sorry, and I said I was going to be brief, and here I am talking about 19.
No. We don't. If I said brief, I didn't mean it.
So, and the reason I'm talking about this is because this rebellion that was launched in 2004, led by then Laurent Nkunda, then called the CNDP, the M23 is really just a successor rebellion to that rebellion, because the CNDP was dismantled in 2006. Was dismantled in 2009, integrated into the Congolese army, then disaffected CNDP members defected again and launched the first M23 rebellion in 2012. That was defeated a year later and was reborn again in 2021, right? So whereas there are 100 different armed groups in the Eastern Congo, some of them, as I said before, are much more important than others. The M23 is one of those. In fact, 3 out of 4 people who were displaced this year in the Congo were displaced because of the M23 rebellion. So 100 different armed groups, some of them are much more important than the others. Okay, so that's sort of a very broad introduction. There's many different things one could talk about, but let me just focus on the M23 just because it is the rebellion that has created the most humanitarian cost, but it also is, I think, symptomatic of the geopolitics of the region. That's very important. You said that we have people from Kenya here joining us. Kenya has played an important role in this. So let me briefly tell the story of the M23, the most recent round of the M23 rebellion, and then I'll shut up. And so in November of 2021, well, actually, let me put it this way. I talked, there's many different stories to tell, but one of the stories to tell is the story of democracy and the impact, one of the extraordinary things about the Congo is that democratic pressures in the Congo have actually been able to do what they haven't done in many neighboring countries. And so the Congo, in contrast with Rwanda, Uganda, Angola, Congo, Brazzaville, has withstood pressures to change the constitution to benefit the incumbent, right? All of the countries I mentioned have, have changed the constitution to the benefit of the person in power,
Mhm.
usually to abolish or to change term limits. In the Congo, there was Joseph Kabila, who was in power from 2001 until 2018, appeared to be trying to do the same thing. And an extraordinary mobilization, cross-cutting, across the country, across social classes, led by the Catholic Church, but not only the Catholic Church, was able really to push back against that. And if you want to talk about the glass half empty, I mean, half full, I think that's it, right? It's an extraordinary determination and mobilization of Congolese people to protect the Constitution and to prevent people, this political elite that is already very, very resented by much of the population, from staying in power any longer. And so what happened in 2018 is Joseph Kabila was forced to hand over power. He did so in a bizarre turn of events where elections were rigged, not in his favor, but in favor of the runner-up, Felix Tshisekedi, in 2019, then came to power and then won, this time fairly, more or less, elections last year in the Congo, and is now in his second term. Now, the reason this is linked to the M23 is that Tshisekedi, when he came in, tried to change the geopolitics of the DRC. Joseph Kabila had an outlook that was very much oriented towards the South, towards the Southern African Development Community. These were his traditional allies, in particular South Africa, but also Zimbabwe, Namibia, Angola. Those were his allies. Now, Felix Tshisekedi coming in a vulnerable position. This was somebody who had never been in power himself, was somebody whose own political party was in disarray, more or less. His father, who had been who had personalized this party and for so long, Etienne Tshisekedi had just passed away. So Tshisekedi comes into power and he tries to change the geopolitics of the country in a way to solidify his own position, including in the security forces. And so he turns eastwards. And he makes an entreaty towards the East African community and then asks the DRC to join the East African community. And if you look even at the story of how he won the 2018 elections, Uganda, but also Kenya were key allies in that. And if you look at actually the people who attended, Uhuru Kenyatta was one of the only African heads of states who attended his inauguration ceremony in January 2019 in Kinshasa. And so he comes into power orienting towards the East and trying to, basically his strategy was to try to muscle out Kabila securocrats that were still firmly entrenched within the army, the intelligence services, but also to make, with an understanding that a lot of insecurity in the East was driven by or backed by people on the other side of the border, in Rwanda in particular, but also in Uganda. He tries to make good with those people. And in the course of the coming years, 2019, he invites in the Rwandan army to conduct military operations in Eastern Congo, to chase down Rwandan rebels. He conducts a series of arrangements, business deals with both Uganda and Rwanda, very lucrative business deals in the East, but also in Kinshasa and Lubumbashi. You see Rwandan businessmen coming into many different sectors. You see Rwanda Air, the national airplane company, starting direct flights, Kigali, Kinshasa. So all of this was an effort for Tshisekedi to realign himself. And it seems very bizarre now, given the state of affairs. What happened then in the summer of 2021, so roughly 2 years after Tshisekedi came into power, are two things. First of all, over the preceding year, faster than anybody really would have thought, and I think this is really, you need to give Tshisekedi credit to do this. Most observers, including myself, did not think he would be able to do this quickly. He was able to muscle out the person who had really put him or given him the job, which was Joseph Kabila, right? And so Joseph Kabila's hold on power that many had thought would be very difficult to dismantle. Kabila, after all, controlled, in 2019, after those elections, he controlled most of the provincial assemblies, most of the provincial governors. He had a majority in the national parliament. Yes, in coalition with Tshisekedi, but definitely his coalition was dominant in that. And Tshisekedi, understanding that Kabila was weak himself and unpopular, slowly began to dismantle that. And then finally kicked Kabila out of this coalition and then reorchestrated a majority in the National Assembly to give him control over government. And so I think that's one of the key achievements that Tshisekedi managed to do. That's one thing that happened. The other thing that happened was that this delicate balancing act between Tshisekedi and allies in the East, reaching out to Rwanda, reaching out to Uganda, ended up creating serious tensions between two of those countries, Rwanda and Uganda. Rwanda and Uganda, one has to remember, in 2021 were not in good standing. They had closed their border. They were arresting opponents and carrying out security operations against what they call operatives, foreign operatives on their soil. So there was this brewing diplomatic row between Uganda and Rwanda in 2021. And into this mix, Tshisekedi comes and is trying to give business deals to one side and the other. And then there's supposed to be an arrangement by which Eastern countries from East African community come in and then support the Congolese army in reestablishing security in the East. So he reaches out to the Burundian army, he reaches out to the Ugandan army, and when he reaches out to the Rwandan army, there's a lot of protests in Goma. And so the Rwandan army are actually not invited to participate. Coming into the mix of this is the fact that there were terrorist attacks in downtown Kampala in November of 2021. Still somewhat mysterious terrorist attacks, but terrorist attacks nonetheless, that killed a large number of people and police officers in downtown Kampala, after which President Museveni, who blames the Islamist ADF, Allied Democratic Forces, who have their rear bases in Eastern Congo, Museveni announces that he's deploying the UPDF officially onto Congolese territory and has been invited in by President Tshisekedi, right? And so this sets the stage for a huge row between Uganda and Rwanda. Rwanda throws a fit, a diplomatic fit, and sees Ugandan UPDF operations into the northeastern DRC actually as a security threat to its own territory, and starts telling diplomats that Uganda is trying to use this as a pretext to destabilize Rwanda. And so Rwanda's move to back what at that point was a dormant rebellion, the M23, was basically nowhere to be seen in November of 2021. Rwanda's move to back the M23 was actually not really due to anything happening in the DRC. Due to these regional forces, it saw itself so this pincer movement against Rwanda. And so Rwanda starts backing the M23 in reaction to that in November of 2021, and then it progressively starts doubling down to the point where, and I'm going to go very quickly now, it deploys 4,000 to 5,000 Rwandan special forces into the Eastern DRC. These are estimates by the United Nations group of experts, and to control a vast swath of territory, a territory that is half as large as Rwanda itself in the Eastern DRC. In fact, at some point, there are more RDF troops deployed there than M23 troops themselves. And so we can talk about the threat of the FDLR, which is a Rwandan rebel group based there. We can talk about discrimination, hate speech against the Congolese Tutsi community, which is a very real thing. Those are the things that Rwanda has put forward, but it's very important to remember that this crisis started out of a geopolitical competition between Rwanda and its neighbors and has grown since then. So maybe I'll end there. We can talk about the peace process. We can talk about meetings in Angola that have been going on between the various countries. But I thought I'd leave it there. I'm happy to talk about that or anything else that people would like to talk about.
Well,
thank you very much.
This is great. You've reminded us that this complex situation is even more complex than we thought. It's first an anecdote. At the time of the election, was it 2018 or 19? I was in Brazzaville, and my Congolese colleagues of the Republic of Congo, the elections were about to happen, and I said, "What do we think is going to happen?" And they were smiling. I love the sense of humor of people in that part of the world. They said, "Oh, never mind. if things go badly, you'll see all the boats crossing the river from their side to our side. And they were laughing about that. It was something of a miracle, was it not, Jason, that that election, it may not have been very pure, but it happened and there really wasn't much violence. I have a few one-word questions. One-word question is Ayulo, the one who, or who was it that the Catholic Church said won that election and who was quickly removed? Was that his name?
Fayulu, and that's
Fayulu.
2018 elections, yeah.
28. Well, what in the world happened there? Do you think that he really got the most votes? The Catholic Church said he did.
I think so the Catholic Church, as well as we actually conducted an analysis together with the Financial Times and Radio France Internationale at the time. And not only did the Catholic, and we were working with the Catholic Church very closely, not only did we have the data from the Catholic Church, we had data, a leak from within inside the Election Commission, and the numbers are very clear that Fayulu won those elections. So yes, Fayulu won. It was a vote, it was a protest vote more than anything else. I don't think people were deeply attached to Fayulu. In fact, we've subsequently seen his popularity has plummeted. But it was a protest vote. They wanted to go with the person they thought was the real opponent to Joseph Kabila. He's still around. Fayulu's kicking around. He's still in the opposition. He still commands a certain amount of popularity. I would say he's probably the third most popular politician in the DRC after Felix Tshisekedi, Moise Katumbi.
Yeah. If he got the most votes and if he's not the president, why not? Who decided he would not be president?
Joseph Kabila, we don't know all the details, but from what we can understand, more or less this happened. Joseph Kabila was trying to rig the elections in favor of his own candidate, a gentleman called Emmanuel Shadari. And basically the head of the election commission, who today has joined the M23, came to him and said, we can't do it. It's a bridge too far. The rigging we'd have to carry out rigging on a scale that, would be blatant. And so Joseph Kabila started reaching out. In fact, at one point he reached out to Fayulu, and then he reached out to Tshisekedi. They've been reaching out to Tshisekedi for a long time before that. He reached out to Tshisekedi and he said, could we here's the deal. I'm going to give you the presidency, but in return, I stay in power in the National Assembly and in the provincial governorships and assemblies. And Tshisekedi accepted that deal, and very crucially, both regional partners, including the Kenyan government, the Ugandan government, but also the United States government, played important roles as guarantors in that deal. We don't know all the details, but in particular, the US government we know was involved, not in orchestrating the deal, but in backing the deal. When I've spoken with US officials since then, and I've pushed them on this because I don't think it's terribly orthodox or a good idea to be backing the rigging of elections, they have pushed back saying it's the best we could have hoped for. Nobody thought in their right mind that Fayulu could have won, that Kabila would have allowed Fayulu to win these elections. And so this was the best we could have hoped for, and so therefore we backed it.
Let's see. I don't claim to know much about this. I do know that the US government and the US State Department in particular, exactly as you said, they feared what they call a bloodbath. If Fayulu were to become president, they were very imaginative. They projected a scenario that if they were right, maybe they did the right thing. I don't think the US government decided this, but I do believe that they were allied with the individuals and forces that you mentioned. So that's a troubling question. How was Fayulu prevented? Anyway, but we leave that to history, I think. And I encourage anybody to come in at any time. We have two individuals, Tshisekedi and Kabila. They're both sons of people. There's Tshisekedi fils and Tshisekedi père. As I understand it, the fathers, there was a great antagonism between the two, much less so with the sons. Can you comment on that? Am I right?
Between Tshisekedi and
Kabila, because we have Kabila père and Kabila fils, right?
Kabila père has left us.
I know, but the two younger the two inherit heirs, shall we call them?
Yes.
They seem to have been able to work out deals, to work together in some way. They seem to not be enemies. Am I right in thinking that?
Well, I mean, they certainly, there's been a lot of back and forth. I'm not sure if there's any great friendship between the two of them. There was an alliance of convenience that happened in the end of 2018. As I said, in order for Kabila to preserve what he thought was his power and for Tshisekedi then to come to power. But Tshisekedi moved very forcefully and very quickly and very adeptly, I would say, against Kabila to dismantle his system. And his system felt like a house of cards. And so
Mhm.
at that point, I would imagine that relations between the two of them became very bad. And there are currently allegations put forward by people around Tshisekedi that Kabila is backing the M23. And if you look at the people within the M23, it's, indeed, there are some people who used to be with Kabila there. Um, Kabila himself, as more or less with, Kabila himself was always a reluctant politician. He is not somebody who delights in the glad handing and sort of the social aspects of politics. He's a bit of a recluse and an introvert, and that has really harmed him and his party politically a lot since he lost power. And so his party, as well as his alliance, the PPRD, has really fallen apart. And almost, many of the cacique, the big fish in the PPRD and Kabila's party have jumped ship. There's very, very few people left around Kabila. Does he have a political future at all left? I don't know. I don't really think he wants to be much in politics anymore. He seems somebody who's sort of disgusted with politics, and yet he has a lot of assets. Tshisekedi has not gone after him personally. And that's sort of something that is typical in Congolese politics, even after, you see a lot of people, Mobutu's people are still around. Setiale, his security advisor, came back many years ago. Mobutu's son is back in the country. So there's this notion, you dismantle the previous regime's power structures, but you don't necessarily go after the personal assets of the people who used to be in power. And I think that agreement probably holds for the relationship between Felix and Joseph.
So can we say that Tshisekedi is in for the foreseeable future? Do you see any challenges?
Well, this is his second and last term. He's term limited. He has until 2028, which is when the next presidential elections are, unless he changes the constitution. So he's definitely in for this foreseeable future. He has, he has his new prime minister just was inaugurated this year, has a new cabinet. It's a fairly technocratic cabinet. So yes, we're in for a Tshisekedi administration unless something unforeseeable happens. I think the big question is what comes after this. And the worry I have is that Tshisekedi himself, and this is sort of to understand the nature of his government and his coalition, it also explains a little bit about how he's dealt with insecurity in the East. He is weak. I mean, he controls the largest majority in the National Assembly ever, right? So on the one hand, he's not weak. Politically, he's very strong. There is no opposition. Opposition is incredibly weak, politically speaking. And yet, the way he has stitched together this coalition does suggest there's a lot of weakness within his own party. One has to remember that Felix himself never really, I mean, the UDPS itself, his political party, was totally controlled by his father when his father was in power. Then his father dies just shortly before Tshisekedi becomes president. And that personalization of the party really damaged the party. And so a lot of the institutions of the party were eroded by that. And so Tshisekedi comes in, and Tshisekedi himself is somebody who spent a lot of time outside of the country in Belgium. And so he comes in, and he doesn't really know the party that well. I mean, he obviously knows the party, but he enters into a party that is fairly institutionally weak. He brings with him a lot of his friends from Belgium. And so the way he manages power, you can see that he himself, even within his own party, which in 2019 was very weak, very small in the National Assembly, his party was weak and small. He then uses his own friends and acquaintances for a lot that are not members of the UDPS for a lot of important portfolios. And so the reason I'm saying this is that if you want to have a clear succession strategy, it behooves you to have a strong party.
Right.
And it does not seem to me that he has a very strong party or that there's a very clear succession within that. Once you remember that the former Secretary General of his party is in prison, Kabund. And there's been a lot of shuffling of power around Tshisekedi. And so my worry is that in the next 4 years, he needs to end up in a place where there is a clear succession around him. Otherwise, there's going to be, I think, a mess. That mess could become difficult, to say the least. I certainly don't hope that he starts to tinker with the Constitution. He will, I think, I mean, I think there will be a debate around many aspects of the Constitution, some of it very valid. I think there's some aspects of the Constitution that need to be looked at and changed, especially, I think, the electoral law. The way the Congo holds elections, proportional, the Congo came out of election. Congo has, I think, 600 political parties. It is an extremely fragmented political space. And one of the reasons for this is that coming out of the conflict in 2003, the constitutional lawyers who designed the Constitution wanted to make it as inclusive as possible. And so what they did is they designed very large districts with proportional representation. You have districts with 15, 16, 17 seats in some parts of the country. And what this means is that you then have people who are voted into the National Assembly without having very strong parties, with actually not even being extremely popular. You can, in some districts, you don't have to you can win with 6% of the vote, 7% of the vote, just because the proportional representation in the districts are so large. So I think there's aspects like that in the Constitution that should probably be changed to lead to a greater centralization, or at least disciplining of the political party ecosystem, if you will. But Tshisekedi might take advantage of that. This is the fear of, I think, some civil society activists, to open up what is called les articles verrouillés de la Constitution, the locked articles of the Constitution, including term limits. The Constitution explicitly says you are not allowed to change term limits. And Tshisekedi may be tempted to do so. We'll have to see.
We remember when
I do think there's a question in the chat. I'm not sure if I'm going to
well,
address.
Ambassador Ray just was mentioning that he has to leave. I think Vivian had a question. Let me go to the chat. Vivian, let's see. Oh, yes, the current state of MONUSCO.
Yes.
I don't know if you can see her question. The current state of MONUSCO, I believe they're planning to withdraw, and also the M23. I talk about the M23 as if I knew what they are. I have no idea who they are, how many they are, where do they come from? Is it totally supported by Rwanda? Is it really an indigenous movement? Maybe you could comment on that.
Right. So the Congolese government had asked, I mean, Kabila used to ask, say, I'm going to ask MONUSCO to leave. So asking MONUSCO to leave is nothing new, but the Congolese government is now determined, I think, to have MONUSCO withdraw. And so we're in what the UN mission has agreed to, a transition out of MONUSCO. The status at the moment is that MONUSCO has basically been confined to two provinces, the province of North Kivu and Ituri, and then, of course, they have their headquarters still in Kinshasa. They are completely withdrawn out of South Kivu. I think there are 40 or 50 people left in South Kivu, and I think they will be withdrawn in June of this year. And so then the bulk of the troops and personnel are then in North Kivu and in Ituri provinces. There is, despite the fact that we're in this transitional period that the Congolese government has asked MONUSCO to withdraw, there is no date that's been given for the final withdrawal of MONUSCO, and the Security Council has been fairly clear that they don't think MONUSCO should completely withdraw as long as there is no clear succession arrangement that's been organized. The M23 came in, and then there was East African Community deployed its first military intervention force. And we thought that might be the transitional arrangement. But then Tshisekedi fell out, or I think he fell out with the East African Community and the deployment of this force. The Congolese wanted this force to militarily offensively disarm the M23, and the East African Community, especially the Kenyan leadership, disagreed with that. And they thought this was going to be an interposition force that would then facilitate peace talks, but not actually aggressively disarm the M23. So Tshisekedi then eventually asked them to leave. And the only part of that stayed was the Burundian part. And then he asked the South African Development Community, SADC, to deploy. So you had South Africans, Malawians, and Tanzanians deploy. They are now present on the battlefield. as well, but it's also unclear if that could ever be a transitional arrangement. That's a purely military force, whereas MONUSCO is much more. They're logistical, they have a humanitarian branch, they have a human rights branch, and so on and so forth. So we're in a bit of a gray zone in terms of what's going to happen with this transition, with MONUSCO transition. As with regards to your question, Dan, what is the M23? That's actually a complicated question. The M23 is a force with its own interests. It's not purely a proxy and a puppet of Rwanda. It is currently dominated by the Rwandan government. As I said, I mean, the M23 emerged is a descendant of the prior mobilization of the M23, which is the descendant itself of the CNDP. But the M23 emerged out of military elites within the Congolese Tutsi and Hutu communities, especially and almost only in the Congolese Tutsi community, and even there, almost only within the Congolese Tutsi community of North Kivu, which is a particular part of the Congolese Tutsi community. And that Congolese Tutsi community and those military leaders, they have their own interests. In fact, they have been sold down the river many times by the Rwandans. Sultani Makenga, for example, the military commander of the M23, is known to have no love lost for the Rwandan government. He's somebody who has actually rebelled against the Rwandan government in the past, been arrested for it, put in prison for it, and will tell you how much he dislikes the Rwandan government. And so it's important to understand that many of these military officers, they have their own backgrounds, they have their own histories and careers. They're deeply entwined with the Rwandan army and the Rwandan government, going back to the days when the RPF was in the rebellion in 1990s, early 1990s. But today, there's an alliance of convenience with the Rwandan government. The Rwandan government has deployed such military force into North Kivu with, missile launchers, with night vision, with snipers. I mean, they've really thrown. This is the special forces, and Rwanda has very proficient special forces. So they've really thrown the kitchen sink at this problem. And so the M23 doesn't have a margin for maneuver within that. But once there is a deal, and there could be a deal in the offing now between the Rwandans and the Congolese under Angolan and American facilitation or pressure, if there is a deal of some shape or form, then the M23 is going to be a pawn that could once again be sold down the river. And I think they're very worried about that. In 2000, I mentioned this gentleman, Laurent Nkunda, when he carried out a rebellion, was backed by the Rwandan government, 2006 to 2009. And the deal that eventually was struck between the Rwandans and the Congolese back then, it led to his arrest. And up until today, Laurent Nkunda is in jail or is under house arrest in Rwanda. His successor, Bosco Ntaganda, who was his chief of staff, and then the leader or one of the leaders of the M23 rebellion in 2012, when there was then a deal between the Rwandans and the Congolese that led to the dismantling of the M2012 in 2013, Bosco fled for his life, and he sought refuge in the American embassy in Kigali because he thought that if the Rwandans got their hands on him, they'd kill him. And so he actually thought it was safer for him to be extradited to the International Criminal Court, in whose jails in The Hague he now lives, than to hand himself over to the Rwandans who have been backing him. That just shows you some of these complicated relations between the M23 and the Rwandan government.
Very, very complicated. And later, not quite. I want to get to Mwantanga's question, which is directed exactly to something you just said about an eventual accommodation between Rwanda and DRC. If you're not able to see the chat, what would be the strategies? How do we end this war? And I would add to that, is the M23 purely bad? Is there anything positive about the M23?
Well, I would say, I mean, let me just address that first. The M23, now, the M23, I think they're using illegitimate means towards their official objective, which is partly legitimate. The M23 will say, if you speak with them, that they're there, well, they'll say many things, but one of the things that they, as well as their predecessors, have said consistently is that they're there to protect the interests of the Congolese Tutsi community. Mm-hmm. Now, in fact, what they've done is they've led to a dramatic deterioration, and they've increased discrimination against the M23, against the Congolese Tutsi community. but they are right to say that there is a history of tension between the Congolese Tutsi community, to say the least. And there's a history of vilification of that community in the Eastern DRC. Now it's complicated because members of that community have carried out terrible atrocities against other Congolese communities. When the RCD rebellion controlled the Eastern Congo for 5 years between 1998 and 2003, it was extremely abusive. It was in charge of many massacres backed by the Rwandan government against Congolese population back then. And some of those massacres were along ethnic lines. And in many of those massacres, you saw prominent participation and even organization of Congolese Tutsi commanders, right? And so to say that they're discriminated against, it's really the victim and killer relationship, this back and forth, this dialectic of victim and killer that needs to be remembered. But one can't, of course, blame a community for the sins committed by members of that community, right? There is an enormous amount of tension between the Tutsi community and other communities. And that, they're absolutely all right. There was never a Truth and Reconciliation Commission really worth its name. There was one, but it wasn't worth its name. And nobody has ever addressed any of these deep and dark histories that need to be dug up. I mean, this was the mapping report that the United Nations released that talked about a lot of these massacres. People are living with these memories on all sides of the conflict. And if you go, as I have, and speak with members of the Tutsi community in North Kivu or the Banyamulenge community, which is Tutsi from South Kivu, they will tell you they'll show you the graveyards, and they'll tell you about all their brothers and sisters and parents that have been killed and massacred because they were Tutsi. And then you go to the neighboring community, Bembe or Hutu or Hunde or Nande, and they will show you their graveyards and say, no, but we were killed and we were massacred by that. So you have these histories that go very deep that have never been discussed. And so I think that's a key part. I mean, you asked me, what are the strategies? I think the problem is now we have an escalation. We have the M23. We have 100 different armed groups. We have no peace process. The only peace process we have is to deal with Rwanda and the Congo. That's an important piece of it. And I think, and I've said often, that's a precondition to do anything else is we need to get rid of this M23 problem. But there's actually, for me, the M23 problem is a fairly simple problem to deal with. It's terrible. It's costly and it's gruesome, but it's actually fairly simple. The bigger problem is dealing with the 100 other armed groups, all the other displaced people, and with these histories of resentments and of loss and of pain that people live with across the Eastern Congo that have never been dealt with. Not to mention, economic growth. And so there's a peace plan that needs to be set in place, desperately needs to be set in place. And I think what needs to be done is this M23 problem needs to be dealt with. That will open up space. Now, how do you deal with the M23 problem? As I said, it's not too difficult. I mean, the good thing about the M23 is that it is dominated by the RDF, by the Rwandan government. And the RDF, the Rwandan government, is a government that is actually very, very vulnerable to international pressure. This is not like most armed groups in the region. This is not like the jihadis in the Sahel or Boko Haram or Al-Shabaab. This is a government that is extremely vulnerable. A third of Rwanda's budget is aid money. Rwanda Rwanda's biggest export is its reputation. Its name is emblazoned on Arsenal jerseys, on PSG jerseys. Its biggest export. They had the naming of the gorilla ceremony. The American comedian Kevin Hart was there. Idris Elba was there. This is the most important export from Rwanda, is its reputation. And so it's extremely vulnerable to international pressure. Now, I think the tragedy, and for me, the extreme weakness and moral failing of the international community has been the fact that we haven't used that leverage. And we haven't used it for a variety of reasons. We haven't used it, I think, just because we don't care. It's not important. It's really, I mean, I'm sure that many people will disagree with me here, but the Congo on the order of priorities for people in Washington is not very important. Washington has criticized Rwanda. Washington has even sanctioned some Rwandan generals. They have applied pressure, but they could do much more. Washington remains the largest donor to Rwanda, USAID programming. And they will tell you, oh, but this programming does great work in health and education. And, you know, that's actually true. There's been great strides in health and education in Rwanda. And so USAID does not want to sanction Rwanda by using aid money to do so, because they say this would come at the cost for the innocent civilian population of Rwanda. That's sort of the pushback you get in Washington when you say this. But much more could be done. Now, I think the people who have really let the ball drop are the Europeans. You know, the EU, in the midst of this crisis, sent money to back the RDF. This is, you know, RDF has 5,000 troops deployed in the Eastern Congo. And what does the EU do? They send 30 million euros in military support to the RDF for its mission in Mozambique. Why? Because the RDF in Mozambique is very important to the French government, and the French government is really pushing for this within the European Union, because the RDF in Mozambique is protecting France's largest company, period, in terms of revenue, which is Total Energy, which is an oil company that is offshore oil and gas mining that it does offshore Mozambique. And that was overrun by an Islamist insurgency in northern Mozambique. And the Rwandans went in and very efficiently cleaned that up, and then are now protecting the gas installations there. And so the EU, I think, has been totally dropped the ball on this, and in particular France. The UK, under its Tory government, in the midst again of the M23 escalation, the Commonwealth Heads of State Summit was held in Kigali with Prince, now King Charles, present. And this was middle of the M23, like 100 kilometers to the west. The M23 was overrunning Bunagana. And Prince Charles was meeting with Paul Kagame and saying what a wonderful job you've been doing, et cetera, et cetera. So the UK government then, of course, signed this asylum deal where all, again, an extremely questionable deal where all asylum applicants to the UK would have to be processed through Rwanda. So I think there's a lot of blame to go around, but in particular, I would like to single out the UK government and the French government for completely having failed with regards to their moral responsibility. And you're in this paradoxical situation where you have, several $1 billion of aid money each year going to Rwanda, and then several $1 billion of aid money going to solve the humanitarian crisis caused by the Rwandan government in the Eastern Congo. You're in this paradoxical situation where you have UN peacekeeping troops on the front line fighting, more or less, with the M23 and Rwanda. And of course, who's the largest peacekeeping contributor to the United Nations in Africa? It's the Rwandan government. And Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, has never dared to mention the name Rwanda. It's actually not allowed. What they say is they talk about foreign forces backing the M23. And his own peacekeepers deployed in the Eastern Congo are under fire by the Rwandan government. And so I think there's been a huge failing, moral failing, strategic failing, and political failing by the international community in this regard. And they failed to take, I think, would be a fairly easy solution to solve this crisis.
Mm-hmm. In terms of vulnerability, in support of what you're saying, when Kagame released Paul Rusesabagina, I think that was largely under U.S. pressure. Let's see, we've lost your audio, Jason, for a moment. Let's see, come back. Jason, if you can hear us.
Main contributor. The chaos. Oh.
Sorry, we want to allow Jason to talk. Let's see.
It was.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, Jason, we lost you for a second. You were talking about, I think you were agreeing that the release of Paul Rusesabagina was partly because of international pressure. Maybe, Jason, I suggest, if you can hear me, Jason, why don't you go to audio, mute your video, and then we may have a better connection with you. Let's see, folks, I think we have lost Jason Stearns. Let me have a look. This is really fascinating. Let me invite him again, and we will live with whatever happens. We know that we're all used to Wi-Fi failures, but okay, I'm inviting Jason Stearns again. Here he is. Okay, good. Here he is. Jason.
Yeah, I'm sorry, my internet,
no.
I'm on my cell phone now. My
Yeah,
internet connection here in Addis
that's
gave out.
that's very innovative of you. I was suggesting that we go out of video and into audio. Thank you for being so quick to come back. I think you were saying that we lost part of what you said, that the release of Paul Rusesabagina was largely because of international pressure. We have a very interesting question in the chat. I'd like to first ask, because I'm afraid this question won't be asked. You mentioned, oh dear.
Sorry.
Okay, that's right.
Sorry.
You cut off there you go. You know, you mentioned parliament and military and leaders and the cupola, as we would call it, the top of the system, as if the system were a pyramid. My guess is that 80 or 90% of the population of DRC has no relationship to any of these power centers and may not even understand who they are. You mentioned a civil society. To what extent does DRC really have a civil society that can be purposeful in determining the future?
Well, I think, I mean, civil society in the Congo is typically very strong. Since the early 1990s, it contributed to the transition to democracy, as it did in Kenya, as it did throughout much of Africa. It was well organized in particular parts of the country, especially South Kivu had a very strong civil society, Kinshasa. And as I mentioned before, there was this heroic mobilization in defense of the Constitution and against Kabila between 2015 and 2018 that barred his third term and pushed him out of power, really. And so, the one part of that question is, Congo civil society is rich, it's diverse, it's strong, it's boisterous. Now, I think it is important to highlight that since Tshisekedi came to power in 2019, there has been some splitting and splintering of that civil society that has always been fragmented and raucous. It doesn't speak with one voice, nor should it. But since 2019, you've seen some parts of that civil society, actually some members of that civil society join government. Happens, I guess, with every government, but that I think has led to somewhat of a weakening of civil society. The Catholic Church has also made clear that it is primarily interested in protecting, I would say, the big picture issues of democracy, but has been much less forceful in terms of engagement on issues such as good governance, corruption, and human rights. It obviously does things on those fronts, but its mobilization is much less strong. So my feeling is that if Tshisekedi tried to push and change the constitution and stay for a third term, you'd see a very strong mobilization again. That seems to be the Rubicon that cannot be crossed in the Congo. But with regards to other issues, civil society has been much less successful. I think, to be honest, you can see this fragmentation in the media happening. You can see this fragmentation in the Congolese civil society happening. And you saw it during the last elections as well. I mean, I think the civil society was less united, less forceful in the 2013 elections than it was in 2018.
Now, if you're able to see the chats, we have an embarrassment of riches. I don't even dare select here. These questions are fantastic questions. Can you take any one of them that I don't know how much time you have, Jason, but we'll keep you another hour if you're available. This is
okay. I'll try to go fast, and thank you very much for indulging. And especially I know that I have some Congolese colleagues on the call as well. Thank you very much for indulging me, a foreigner, talking about your country for so long.
And my last question whenever we finish will be, how did you get to know DRC so well? Tell us about your own personal story. Before we get to that, pick any of these chats. These are all fantastic questions, I think. And I'm very, very glad. If anybody would like to raise hand, I can unmute you. But yeah, let's see.
Yes, so there's a question about the East African Community Regional Force and the political versus military solutions. I think this gets to the heart of the misunderstanding between, or not the disagreement between the East African community and the Congolese government. The East African community largely agreed, I would say, with the M23, that the reason the M23 came into existence was because of a political problem. Whereas the Congolese government insisted that this was not a political problem, this was a problem of ambition. This was a problem of power. This is why the Congolese government refused to talk to the M23. And so I think that there are political problems that are, and another one of your contributors mentioned them. There is a serious problem with regarding the status of the Congolese Tutsi community, past crimes that have been committed, justice. There's very important. There are 90,000 Congolese Tutsi. In fact, a large percentage of the North Kivu Congolese Tutsi community is in refugee camps in Rwanda, where they're, by the way, not treated very well. And so all of those are key problems. My understanding of the situation is that those are not the problems that caused the crisis to begin with, but Rwanda has brandished them to try to legitimize their intervention. Now, I agree that there are serious problems. I disagree that they were the problems that caused the crisis in the first place. And so I think that it would be wrong. M23 is not the legitimate actor to negotiate those things with. They do not represent the Tutsi community. And the M23 itself actually doesn't have much leeway within the, within the dominance of the Rwandan government and the Rwandan force. So I would say that on that is a shorthand to answer that question. So China, this is a very interesting question. Now, there is another geopolitical struggle happening in the Congo, and that's between China and the United States. There's no question about this. The Congo is the largest producer of copper in all of Africa. It is the second largest producer of copper in the world now. In fact, I just looked at these figures today. It's even just within the last 3 years, its copper production has doubled. It now exports 2.8 million tons of copper. It is way bigger than Zambia in terms of its copper production. Zambia used to be the largest producer in Africa. The Congo is now way out in front. The largest mining company in the Congo is called Glencore, and it's based in Switzerland, and it's listed on the London Stock Exchange. It produces around 20% of that copper. Of the remaining 80%, a large majority are Chinese companies. In fact, there are no large American companies involved in copper mining in the Congo anymore. There used to be, Freeport-McMoRan, based in Arizona, but they sold to Chinese companies. Most of the large copper companies and cobalt, Congo is also the largest cobalt producer in the world. And this, of course, is important for the green energy transition and for electric vehicle batteries. And so, yes, the Congo is an extremely important geopolitical player, and both the Chinese and the Americans are very interested. I would say the Americans are, I would be dismayed if the Congo became a pawn in this power struggle. But at the same time, I would be delighted if the Congo could actually use leverage that it finds in this power struggle to its own advantage and to get greater investments from both sides. And in particular, what the Congo needs to do is diversify its economy. The Congo, as it's always been throughout its history, is a raw resource exporting country. It exports almost nothing but raw minerals. 95% of its exports are raw minerals, unprocessed. And that's a huge problem for the economy. Industrial mining produces almost no jobs. It's done with massive machines and produces very, very, very few jobs. If the Congo wants to accelerate its development, and it's definitely grown enormously as a country, but most of that wealth goes to a very, very small elite of people. And part of it's because of the structure of the economy that depends so much on raw resource extraction. It needs to be able to add value to those resources. And so if it could leverage that power struggle between the United States and China to try to create auxiliary, industries, add value, industrialize. For example, the United States has tried and struggled. I don't think they've been terribly successful in creating a battery manufacturing battery manufacturing industry between Zambia and the Congo. It's a great idea. And so I think the Chinese have enormous assets and resources to bring to the table in that. We'll have to see how it goes. But the Congo is definitely. I mean, I've never seen so many I've worked in the Congo for 23 years. I've never seen so many high-ranking American officials visit the Congo as in the last few years. And the reason for that is very simple. It's copper and it's cobalt. And it's China, right? So there's another question I want to address here very quickly in the chat, which is about minerals, since we're talking about minerals, and the neighboring countries, especially Rwanda. Now, it may surprise you to hear the largest exports in terms of value of Rwanda, Uganda, and Burundi is gold. All three countries, much more than coffee, much more than tea, much more than anything else is gold. And for all three of those countries, the vast majority of that gold comes from the Congo. So the three countries, but it's important to understand how that trade is organized. That statistic I just gave you was the case before the M23 rebellion broke out. You do not have Rwandan proxies or Rwandan soldiers or Rwandan militias or Ugandan or Burundian in gold mines in the Eastern Congo. That's not how this works. These mines are controlled by Congolese for the most part. They're mostly artisanal mines, pick and shovel Congolese miners. It's the networks, the trade networks that then go out to neighboring countries where there are fewer taxes to be paid, but also where they get the capital from state-run enterprises, especially in Rwanda, or from business people close to the government, as is in the case of Burundi and Uganda. And that gold then goes out to Dubai. Almost all of that gold goes out to Dubai, right? And so this is not the case that the M23 is occupying gold mines. It doesn't occupy gold mines. It occupies a cassiterite mine and a coltan mine. It doesn't occupy any of the gold is where the big money is. This is a lot. This is roughly speaking. So what I just mentioned there, that's a trade that's worth something on the order of $4 billion a year. It's a lot of money. It's an enormous amount of money. But so how does this work? Right? If they don't control the mines, and if this situation exists that predates the M23, then how is that linked to conflict? That's a very good question. I don't pretend to have the absolute answer to that, but my hypothesis or theory is that what these countries benefit from most of all is disorder. They benefit from disorder and they benefit from a predatory state in the Congo that is unable to assert control and sovereignty over these resources and to use them. And the Congolese state has started out trying to do that. It is working with a company owned by an emir in Abu Dhabi called Primera Gold to try to wrest control from the neighboring countries over the gold. So a small part of the gold export is now increasingly being exported by the Congolese, by a company basically close to the Congolese government and the UAE. But most of this is still controlled by the neighboring countries. And so I think that's important to understand. It's disorder that they benefit from the most, not necessarily direct control of. And then, of course, how does the United States and the UK and France, they don't actually, they benefit from this extremely indirectly in the sense that that gold goes to Dubai and then eventually makes its way into, and some of it goes to India, eventually makes its way into the world's economy. Just like the copper and cobalt, almost all of the copper and cobalt, 99% of the copper and cobalt goes to East Asia, China, Indonesia, Malaysia for smelting, and then makes its way into the world economy like that. But it's not the case that any of these, there are almost no American or British or French companies involved in that particular trade. And so to think that this is the tragedy, again, it would be almost easier for me to understand the British and the French and the Americans' moral lapses if I could say, aha, it's because X, Y, and Z is benefiting from the gold and the tin. It's not even like that. They're not even benefiting from it that much, right? And so all the more reason to be able to exercise this pressure and this control.
A companion piece to this discussion will be Vivian Sequeira, who's on the call today. She's a child of DRC years ago, and she is going to talk on October 16th about the Lobito corridor, which she will explain to us the complexity and maybe and a certain degree of success in US and EU joining to make at last an infrastructure project. There have been far too few of those. Anyway, I invite everybody to think of October 16th. We'll hear more about Lobito corridor. What Jason is brief, I sometimes call this the African smorgasbord, Jason, because it used to be that the Soviet Union and the United States and Western Europe, Africa had a binary choice between East and West. Now that there's Turkey, India, China, even Hungary is good. I wonder if this could possibly work to Africa's benefit if they choose wisely, and strategically they're partners because they now have more than two choices. They have 7 or 8. And you mentioned Abu Dhabi and UAE. Do you think that this, if managed well, could all of this work to Africa's benefit?
I mean, that's a big if. I definitely think a world in which Africans can pick and choose their allies and use that to emancipate themselves from a world that has been focused on the enrichment and empowerment of a very small, mostly Western countries for the past 100 years is probably a better world for Africa, yes. But it's a big if. I mean, I'm in Ethiopia. Right next door, we have Sudan.
Oh, yeah.
The Sudanese civil war is being bankrolled and supported by the government of the UAE.
Right.
We have now a budding war between, or conflict between Ethiopia and neighboring countries, Eritrea and Somalia, over access to the sea. That's now embroiled in regional conflict with Egypt and the UAE, much more involved than the United States in many ways in those countries. You have, of course, China, which is the largest trading partner of most of these countries, which is the largest builder of infrastructure in most of these countries. So I do think that there's a lot there for countries like the DRC to gain. But the key thing is it who stands to gain? Is this the narrow elites that are in power? I mean, here, for example, in Ethiopia, the UAE and the Gulf countries came in big time in massive agricultural plantations. Hundreds of thousands of acres were given to companies from the Middle East. Ordinary Ethiopians did not benefit from that, unfortunately. From that development. A narrow elite benefited from it. And the Congo, the same thing. I mean, Congo has seen the Congolese budget today. So when I first went to the Congo in 2001, the national budget of the Congo was, so in 2002, just after the peace process, the national budget was half a billion dollars. Tiny. I mean, my university, New York University budget is about $8 billion without the medical school, right? So the Congolese budget was tiny, absolutely tiny in 2002. Today, Congo's budget is around $14 billion, $13 billion, right? So its budget has gone up enormously. Unfortunately, not nearly enough money of that is being invested in the Congolese population, in public services, in roads, in health and education, and so on and so forth. And so the history of the Congo is a history of its wealth and its country being taken advantage of, first by foreigners, mostly Europeans and Americans, but also by a narrow Congolese elite. And so if yes, multilateralism could eventually break the hold of part of that, but it's not clear to me that it's going to benefit the people. If it did, I'd be very, very happy. I think first and foremost, probably it's going to benefit elites who are brokering and negotiating those deals.
Mm-hmm. Now, we don't want to exhaust you. We'll keep you 3 more hours if you're available. But let me ask, what took you to DRC in 2001? And why is it that you're so deeply involved in its destiny? When did this become personal to you?
Well, I was interested in international justice. I graduated from college in the United States. And I had lived in Tanzania previously, so I spoke Swahili, and I spoke some French because I'd grown up in German-speaking Switzerland, but I learned French in school. And so I was supposed to go to law school, and I didn't want to go straight to law school. I wanted to get some experience working on international justice. And so the head of the human rights program, Peter Rosenblum was his name, at the law school I was supposed to go to. I ended up bugging him. I was like, I want to go work in part of the world before I go to law school. And then finally, he had a conversation with me where he learned that I spoke Swahili and French. I knew at this point, I knew nothing. I was 22 years old. I knew nothing about the Congo. And he said, you have to go to the Congo. And I said, okay, fine, I'll be happy to go to the Congo. And he picks up the phone and he calls a local NGO based in Bukavu, which is Eastern Congo, called Héritier de la Justice. And he said, would you guys like a volunteer to work with you? And they said, sure. And so in September of 2001, I got on a plane and I went to volunteer for a local NGO in the Eastern Congo. I lived with a local family in Bukavu for that year. And then eventually I became much more interested in the politics of the country than in judicial or legal mechanisms for solving the crisis. and sort of took on its own momentum from there. I lived in the Eastern Congo. I worked on the Eastern Congo for the next 5 or 6 years, 7 years, actually. I wrote a book on the war, and then I went to do my PhD on the Congo, and things sort of took on. So when did it become personal? Probably the moment I arrived in Rwandan-occupied Bukavu in September of 2001.
Remarkable. And we, our heads are exploding with the complexity of this country, which is the size of Western Europe or the size of the United States east of the Mississippi. It's an incredibly huge, rich country, very badly managed over history. And but you have indicated that there are many ifs here, there could be a bright future if the country is properly managed and if the population becomes the driving interest of those who are in charge. Thank you very, very much. Baudouin asks the title of your book, and my bad, I don't have that available. What is your book on DRC? Is what?
There's 2 books. There's one that's translated into French. The first book is called Dancing in the Glory of Monsters. That tracks the history of the Great Congo Wars, 1996 to 2003. In French, it's called Danser à la gloire du monstre, and it's available from a book, a Congolese publishing company called Mlimani Editions. It's based in Goma. So they have, you could probably buy it in Congolese bookshops. There's my second book that's a much more academic book, perhaps less enjoyable for the general crowd. And by the way, the Dancing in the Glory of Monsters is available in a variety of bookstores in Nairobi as well as online. And the second book is called The War That Doesn't Say Its Name. And it was published now 2 years ago by Princeton University Press, and unfortunately is only available in English and Japanese. So hopefully a French edition of that will be coming soon.
Princeton. Okay, very good. And we have all looked at your recent, I think it was in July or August, your absolutely wonderful article in Foreign Affairs. And you are the man. And I mean, there are others, of course, but we really admire what you've done and what you're doing. I think it's very important for us to remember what it is that got you into this. It was your interest in justice. We've talked about in our other sessions, we've talked about what do people want most in countries that are under great stress and challenge. If you give them a list, security, jobs, infrastructure, they always come out wanting justice more than anything else, as you have done. So thank you mille fois. On te remercie mille fois. On garde le contact. And for those who are available next week, we'll be meeting Chris Fomunyo, who is the Africa person at the National Democratic Institute. We'll talk more about what NDI does and IRI and NED. Some of the listeners are familiar with those 3 organizations that promote a democracy development in other countries. And a special thanks from our friend Peterson Waweru. This is tremendous commitment, Jason. Thank you for your work. Let Peterson's words be our conclusion. Thank you, Jason, so much. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for your time.
Okay. On garde le contact.